tonight I'm talking about the landscape of poverty across the United States and how place, race, and measurement matter. I'm a demographer and a sociologist by training, so I tend to think in numbers. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to clarify, but hopefully this will make sense as I go forward. I also want to acknowledge this work draws upon both my research at the Carsey School and at the Stanford Center on Poverty and Inequality. So I'm indebted to my colleagues at both institutions for their input and their collaborations. So just by way of an overview of my plan for this evening, first I'm going to talk about what we mean by poverty, what the numbers I'm going to display refer to. Then I'm going to talk about what the trends have been since the nation started measuring poverty. Then how poverty is geographically distributed across the United States, and how an alternate understanding of poverty changes the landscape of where people are most economically distressed. And I'm going to end with some work on California specifically and what's going on in your state here. So poverty historically has been measured by something called the official poverty measure. It was developed in the early 1960s, right around the time President Obama was born, and adopted officially in 1969, the year we landed on the moon. It's basically a comparison of a bucket of resources that's basically cash income before taxes compared to a threshold based on the cost of food, a very basic budget of food times 3. The only adjustment that's been made to this measure over time is for inflation. So I'll talk later about how that limits our understanding of poverty. Further, this measure doesn't account for expenses that people have. This is a gross income measure, so it doesn't account for things like taxes paid, or more importantly for low-income populations, expenses like childcare, transportation to work, medical out-of-pocket, and other necessities. Further, this measure is a one-size-fits-all measure for the nation. It's the same threshold. It does vary by family composition, family size, and age of the householders, but it's the same threshold whether you're in California or New York City or the Mississippi Delta or Wisconsin or wherever in the nation you happen to be. Finally, I want to emphasize that this is a household-based survey. Sometimes when I talk about child poverty in particular, people say, well, shouldn't all kids be poor? Kids don't work generally. They don't earn an income. But this is based on the income of the family. So the kids who are in poverty as a result of their parents' or guardians' income. Finally, since it's a household-based survey, there is some inclusion of institutionalized populations, but these surveys don't include the homeless. So we don't know how that population impacts these numbers, and it's certainly differential across the nation. And I apologize that I'm not going to speak to that tonight, but I wanted you to know that important caveat. Okay, so my first data slide. If you look here, the top, this is directly from a Census Bureau publication, and it's the official poverty rate and the millions of people, the number in millions, in poverty across time. And if you just look at the two endpoints, it looks like the nation's doing pretty well. We started out at about 22.5% poor and went down to 14.5%. But when you look at the numbers, because the population has grown so much, many, many more people are poor. I also want to highlight the far right-hand shaded blue region. That's the most recent Great Recession, where we saw dramatic, sharp increases in the poverty rate and the number of people in poverty. And what's particularly troubling to me when I look at this is that the recession officially ended several years ago, and we still see that rate relatively plateaued. It came down about 0.5 percentage point between 2012 and 2013, but still is dramatically higher than the pre-recession level. So as promised, I wanted to talk about how poverty varies across the nation. In my home state of New Hampshire, we have the lowest poverty, but still 8.8% of our residents are below that official poverty threshold. And in Mississippi, where we have the highest poverty, nearly 1/4 of the population is poor. Here in California, it's somewhere in the middle, about 16.5%. So in general, we see the highest poverty sort of in the southeast and the southwest, and the lowest poverty in the upper Midwest and New England states. Now, this slide is a little tricky to read, and I didn't put this up here to test your eyesight. Let me talk for a minute, and then I'll explain why this is relevant. We know that poverty doesn't affect all demographic groups equally. In fact, there are dramatic racial ethnic disparities in poverty. For this slide, we compared the Black poverty rate to the white poverty rate, and then separately, the Hispanic poverty rate to the white poverty rate. If that value was 1, they would be the same. If it were less than 1, the minority group would have lower poverty, and a value greater than 1 indicates higher poverty for the minority group. The first thing I want to point out about this graph is that for the 50 states and plus the District of Columbia, it starts at 1. In no state is Hispanic or Black poverty lower than white poverty. 2 other points I want to make, though, because it's important to think about the rate of poverty and the disparity in conjunction. So if we look at the state with the greatest disparity in Connecticut, we see 3.5 to 4.5 times the poverty rate for Hispanics or Blacks. However, in Connecticut, poverty is far lower than in most areas of the country. So even though Blacks and Hispanics are at a greater relative disadvantage, absolute poverty is lower. On the other hand, West Virginia is one of our highest poverty states, but the races are far more equal. There's still a disparity, but a much smaller one than in Connecticut. Looking at this a little bit differently, this is showing several things. So the green counties, these are county maps, are counties with a high proportion of Black residents. The blue have a high proportion of Hispanic. The turquoise have a high proportion of Native people. The few peach-colored have a high proportion of Asian. And then the orange are multi-ethnic, and the yellow are high proportion of 3 or more racial ethnic groups. And I think the takeaway from this, the outlines, the ones with the dark outlines are high poverty. In 2012, 20% or more of the people were in poverty. And I show this to show that poverty affects places with all types of racial compositions. And one of the things I talk about, because when we talk about disproportionality, a lot of people know that most racial minorities, and Asians are the exception, have higher poverty than whites. But people don't understand that there are places where whites have exceptionally high poverty. And you see that in Appalachia and the Ozarks. And even though we have dramatic disproportionality, because the white population is so large, there are a tremendous number of white people in poverty. So it affects the races differently, the meanings, the implications, the reasons are different. But this poverty is an issue that affects all racial ethnic groups. I also want to show how place matters. I do a lot of work looking at rural, suburban, and urban places and how the safety net programs that our nation has vary in their impact depending on where people live. So here, the metropolitan counties are the dark gray and the dark blue. The dark blue are the ones where 20% or more people are in poverty. And the non-metro are the lighter counties and the dark red. And there's a real disparity here in that almost 1/3 of rural or non-metropolitan counties have high poverty, but only around 20% of urban counties have high poverty. But again, it's that issue of the rate versus the absolute numbers, because far more people live in the urban counties. Even though there are fewer of them, they're so much more densely populated. All right, so I talked earlier about the official poverty measure, and everything I've presented so far is based on that measure. But there are a lot of people who critique that measure, saying, well, it doesn't account for all of our safety net programs. Things like food stamps or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, CalFresh in California, are considered in-kind or non-cash because there are limits on how people can use them. It has to be on approved food products. And things like the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a post-tax transfer, aren't included. Further, the whole notion that expenses aren't accounted for is problematic. And the way the threshold is constructed, both on having food account for 1/3 of a budget and having it the same across the nation, is problematic. So the Census Bureau, in conjunction with the National Academy of Sciences panel recommendations, developed an experimental measure, the Research Supplemental Poverty Measure. And this measure, when they're considering the resources to compare to the threshold, includes earnings. It includes almost all safety net receipt. So CalFresh is back in, the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, All these types of benefits are included, and any other income that is captured in our surveys is also included. Further, before comparing that bucket of resources to the threshold, expenses on things like childcare, transportation to work, and out-of-pocket medical expenses are taken away. So whereas you can think of the official poverty measure as using a gross measure of income, this is a net resources measure. That threshold, that line, if you're above it, you're not poor, and if you're below it, you're poor, is adjusted in different ways. For everyone in the nation, it considers average consumer spending on food, clothing, shelter, and utilities. So rather than saying it's tied to that 1/3 formula, it's looking at a percentile of consumer spending on that bucket. And it's also adjusted geographically for the cost of housing. And this becomes really important in understanding who is economically impoverished. So here on the left, I have the map that I showed you earlier of the official poverty measure for the nation. And on the right, I have the supplemental poverty measure for the nation. And I do this to show how the landscape of poverty shifts. So whereas before we had these pockets of low poverty in the Northeast and the upper Midwest, now we still see some of those, but it's even more dramatic in the Midwest. And we see places with really high housing costs like California and New York have much, much higher poverty. And there is one point I want to make. I think that this supplemental poverty measure is a dramatic improvement. In some ways, it gives us different information than the official poverty measure. But when this came out, there was some pushback saying, are you saying California, the land of opportunity, has higher poverty than Mississippi? And I think one of the things that's really important to mention and think about is the context of poverty. If you're growing up poor, where you grow up and the resources of that community and the amenities and the type of people you're exposed to and the type of opportunities you're exposed to matter dramatically. And so if you're in rural Mississippi and you're poor, your opportunities, even net of your family circumstances, are very different than if you live in San Francisco and you're poor. It's hard to be poor in either case, but there are qualitative differences that as researchers we still don't fully understand, and we're thinking about ways to better capture how these different measures translate on the ground in people's lives. So another one to test your eyesight here is the official poverty measure and the supplemental poverty measure by state. And the important takeaway is just to show this a little bit differently. Up on the top, we have places where the supplemental poverty measure is higher. Again, California, New York, the District of Columbia, Nevada, Florida. And then on the bottom, we have the places where it's lowest. And what I want to point out is we saw from the rural map before that there were so many rural counties with high poverty. It's in some of our most rural states that the official poverty measure is lower than the supplemental poverty measure, and we know this can largely be attributed to differences in the cost of housing. So places like Iowa, North Dakota, and Vermont are at the bottom of that list. So I show this slide and people sort of step back and say, whoa, because as you can see, that the blue bars here are the official poverty rate, and the red bars are the supplemental poverty rate. And when you look at the nation, they're pretty similar. It is a difference of 2.6 million people, but because the nation is very populous, the rates are not that different. They're on the same order of magnitude. When you look at California and you look at those bars, that red bar is way taller than the blue bar. And I kind of scratched my head, wait a minute. In the US, 2.6 million people more people are poor under the SPM. But in California, it's 2.7 million more. So in the rest of the United States, where they're virtually equal, there's about 150,000 fewer people poor. Now, of course, some of the states like New York contribute more people, and some of the states like Vermont contribute fewer. So it's an average, that's the net total. But it was really a shock across California when this first came out in 2012 to see how dramatically different the portrait of poverty is under this measure. So this came out and there was a lot of interest, and as improved as the supplemental poverty measure is, there was concern that it didn't fully capture the experiences within California. So the Center on Poverty and Inequality teamed with the Public Policy Institute of California to develop what we call the California Poverty Measure. And it's very much modeled after the Supplemental Poverty Measure, but it does a few additional things. First, we know from our research that participation in social safety net programs is underreported in our household surveys. So we use administrative data from each county in California to match totals of receipt on programs like CalFresh, the state's SNAP program, and CalWorks, the state's TANF program. California, as you know, has a large population of undocumented immigrants. Some of the tax models that the census uses imperfectly account for this and assign benefits, and so we correct for that and then identify the likely undocumented and try to assess who is eligible for social programs and who is not in understanding benefit receipt. We also adjust the thresholds for local housing costs based on tenure. Now, the census does a housing cost adjustment. Ours is at a finer geography within California and also takes into account the unique situation in California due to some property tax laws of owners without a mortgage. So we adjust based on status if you're a renter, if you're an owner with a mortgage, or an owner without a mortgage. And there are some other California-specific characteristics, the SSI cash out and other nuanced things that we adjust for, which I'm happy to talk about if folks have questions. And this measure really allows for a better local understanding. The SPM that the census puts out, you have to combine 3 years of data to look at states as a whole, so it's really hard to drill down to see what's happening within states. And then this is, as I said, more comprehensive and nuanced because of the California-specific factors that are accounted for. And one of the most exciting things for me, it's a potential tool for addressing how policy changes might alter the landscape of poverty in the state. So we haven't yet released the measure for 2012, and for those who use census data, you know that there are often long delays between when things are measured and when they're released. So this is one of the first presentations of it. And you can see that in 2012, about 16.4% of Californians were poor under that first measure I talked about, the official poverty measure, 23.2% under the supplemental poverty measure, and about 21.7% under CPM. And the reason it's lower under the California poverty measure is because we attribute more safety net benefits than people report. And we think that that's more accurate because the safety net is delivering more people out of poverty than accounted for in the survey. Of course, like the other measures, we see demographic differences. Largely, these follow our expectations. Women have slightly higher poverty. Blacks and Hispanics have much higher poverty. Unique to California, though, is how much Hispanic poverty drops, and that's largely due to the immigrant population of Hispanics in the state. And children have the highest poverty, although I will mention that in an official poverty framework, elderly or age 65 plus is much, much lower than child poverty, but medical out-of-pocket costs drive many elderly across the country into poverty. So it's much higher in this type of a framework than under the official. Within California, of course, there's regional variation, and I've circled here Los Angeles County, which is the proud home of the largest share of poor residents, and this is largely driven by housing costs, not surprisingly, and pockets of poverty. There are some really affluent communities, but also some very poor ones. In California, we see that most people, 70%, live in high-cost counties. And in these counties, that poverty threshold, and again, it's different for each county, the average threshold for a family of 4 is over $30,000. So almost 1.5 times the federal threshold under official poverty. In the 10% of counties where people have low housing costs in California, the threshold is pretty similar to the federal poverty. And so it's the poverty rate in those is much more similar. And then there are some mid-range counties where the threshold is a little bit higher, but not so high as that 70%. But the big takeaway is that green share is so large, and that's really a huge driver of why that stark graph I showed that showed how that the difference between the red and the blue bars, with California being the highest in the nation. So one of the things we can do with this measure, because it accounts for safety net program participation, we can subtract that out. We can recompute that net resources bundle without various safety net programs to see how safety net programs are ameliorating poverty. And we see that if we compute poverty without the safety net, and then this lumps them all together for the purpose of this slide, but we've also looked individually at each of the programs at WIC, at SNAP, I'm sorry, not WIC, SNAP and the child tax credit, the earned income tax credit, and so forth. And you see that, those programs reduce poverty by about 1/3 in Los Angeles. Not the best in the state, more along the average. They do a better job in Northern and Central Sierra, California, but they're doing a lot of work towards reducing the poverty rate. But this shows how far we have to go. And when we think about how starkly high the California poverty rate is under this measure, that's net of all of our safety net programs. So we have dramatically high poverty here, even with all of these programs taken into account. So, as I said, I'm excited by the policy potential of this measure. And one of the things the CPM team has been doing is serving as a resource to the state legislature. We get requests periodically to see. So one of the things they asked was, we're thinking about expanding the EITC benefit to families with, say, 3 or more children by this percentage. How would that affect poverty? And we can look at both the rate of poverty, which most of these expansions are relatively small, so they don't have huge effects on moving the needle at the rate, but we can also look at people who are lifted closer to the poverty line, so who may be less poor. And we know from a vast array of research that the further below the poverty line people are, the more dire the consequences. We're also modeling the effect of increased CalFresh take-up. So you saw in the earlier slide that the safety net is not equal across California. Some of it's due to county variation in administration, but some of it is due to variation in who among eligibles enrolls. So if we assume that all of those who look like they're eligible for CalFresh enrolled, how would the poverty rate change? And finally, how would expanding CalWORKs, how would giving a bigger TANF-type payment to poor families influence the experience of poverty? So there are a lot of different scenarios we can do, and sometimes, we first start out looking, okay, if everything else stayed the same, how would these change? But then we also make some assumptions about, if there was a bigger EITC and more people started working, if we assume a 10% increase in the employment rate, what would that do? And sort of to put some parameters around how these programs might have a broader impact. So just to kind of sum up, I know this was a lot of information, sort of 3 different themes I touched on. So the first big takeaway is that national poverty trends really mask variation at the state level and by key demographics, that the states really vary dramatically in the level of poverty. Supplemental poverty measurement offers a new lens on where poverty is most egregious, so that whole landscape, in many places really shifts and we see a different portrait. And we know that housing, an essential need really in core metropolitan areas drives the landscape. I said in California because I focused on that, but that's also in New York and Florida and some of these other states that go up dramatically. And we know that safety net programs ameliorate poverty, but the effect differs across the state. And that was that last slide I talked about, the last graph. So I appreciate your attention. I'm going to stop there, but we'll welcome questions and comments.
There'll be lots of time for question and answers afterwards. I'll throw one out right now, is the impact of raising the minimum wage. I'll just leave it on the ground.